as mentioned, I am going to be sharing with you all findings from a systematic review that was conducted, and this was presented at the early SIG 15 conference in Belgium in September. So it's parental involvement interventions and the outcomes of children with special educational needs. And I was just saying to Erica, I really enjoyed doing a systematic review, and she asked me if I'd do another one. And I said yes, but I only had to extract data from about 13 studies. So, you know, if there were more studies, it would be a very different response. But in terms of just a bit about myself, I know Nadina briefly went over this. So I'm a senior inclusion advisor within a local authority, working with schools in the local authority. I was previously a SENDCO, so Special Educational Needs Coordinator and Assistant Head Teacher at an incredibly large secondary school and primary school. And I'm a part-time student at the UCL's IOE. I'm a massive Arsenal fan for those football fans that are here. And I do love cats, but mainly just my cat. In terms of my research interests, my interests are within inclusive practice, parental involvement and engagement, and special educational needs. So in terms of this systematic review, the overview of today's presentation and what I'll be discussing is I'll go through the following 3 research questions that the review aimed to explore. The aim of the systematic review was really to ascertain the methodologies utilised in the intervention studies, the impact of the interventions on outcomes, and what gaps remain within research. And it's, for those that saw this presentation, I think in Belgium, you'd be quite surprised with the findings. And for those that haven't, I hope it gives you some things to think about. So in terms of the rationale, both seminal and recent literature continue to support the rhetoric that a parent's involvement and their engagement, as well as meaningful school partnerships, are really important components to a child's educational outcomes. But furthermore, this research has indicated that parents of children with special educational needs deal with more bureaucracy, concerns and barriers, but they also feel that they have insufficient information to effectively support their child's learning, and at times feel unsure on how they can assist their child. There is limited research on this. There's limited research in terms of parental involvement interventions for parents of children with special educational needs. So these 3 factors really are the basis in terms of the rationale behind this review. And for the purpose of this review, I think it's really important to define what is meant by parental involvement interventions. Within the literature, parental involvement and parental engagement are used interchangeably, but at times they are looking at various different aspects and factors that include parents and agencies that work with parents. So for the purpose of this study, parental involvement interventions were interventions developed by a school or an external agency involved with the child. So that could be, you know, whether it's within a clinical setting or additional agencies working with the child through the school or outside of the school, that aim to support parents with the education, behaviour and well-being of their child. I know it can be quite a confusing definition, but hopefully I'll give you a moment just to read through that again. So interventions developed by a school or external agency involved with the child that aim to support parents with the education, behaviour and well-being of the child. So what studies were included? The population of this review focused on parents of children aged 4 to 18. This was largely due to the varying ages of the start and end of compulsory education across the world. We really wanted to include studies conducted worldwide to ensure a broad range of studies were included due to the anticipated lack of relevant research, and from scoping reviews that were conducted within this area and a meta-analysis that I'd read, there was a real lack of research within this area. The interventions had to be for parents of young people with special educational needs. So interventions could be both individual and group-based, delivered in any manner, and they could be based in any setting. And again, this was to ensure that all relevant studies were considered for the review. Now, if studies had parental involvement that was aimed at neurotypical children, then researchers were contacted in order to obtain the data for any children with special educational needs within the study, and no restrictions were placed on the type or number of control groups. The review included studies that identified parental involvement interventions that impacted education, behavioural and wellbeing outcomes. And just to clarify what is meant by that, by education, that focused on academic progress, school attainment and cognitive ability, and by behavioural, it included school and home behaviours, conduct, attendance, and by wellbeing, it meant anxiety, stress, depression, and sleep. But in addition to the child-related outcomes, if a study reported parental efficacy as a secondary outcome, parental efficacy was also evaluated. And again, no restrictions were placed in terms of the study design. Qualitative, quantitative, and mixed method designs were included, but the studies had to have been conducted between 2001 and 2022. Now, a protocol of the systematic review was pre-registered on OSF, and these were the search terms that were utilised. And one thing that became apparent when conducting the scoping review before considering this systematic review was the variation in terms of language that was used as well. So we tried to ensure that the language here would try to capture as much of the literature that was available, and as much of the literature that was both published and unpublished. And in that, with regards to that, both academic and grey literature, published literature, and grey literature databases were utilised. There were 5 academic databases, and you'll see them on the right-hand corner, that were used, and 4 grey literature sources that were used. In addition to this, citation and reference list searches were also conducted on the reviews that were included in the study following the full text review, and that was to ensure again that a wide range of literature was included, and also to mitigate against publication bias too. So when it came to reviewing studies at full text, quite a few studies were, no, I won't show you that just yet. So 3,223 studies were reviewed on title and abstract, and there were 80 studies assessed at full text. And when it came to reviewing the studies at full text, there were quite a few that were excluded for a number of reasons. So in terms of the neurotypical population where the interventions, who the interventions were for, in this case, to ensure that as much literature was captured, authors were emailed. Unfortunately, we didn't get much of a response from all of the authors emailed, and 6 responded and indicated that they didn't have data for students with special educational needs. But one thing that was quite interesting were the number of studies. So there were around 12 studies where there was no correspondence information for the authors on the papers that were published. And even after searches via Twitter and LinkedIn, it was becoming incredibly difficult to find any correspondence addresses for them. Parent-related outcome measures, they were excluded if they exclusively focused on parent-related outcome measures. And it's great that research is considering the impact on parents, but again, how this review was focusing and investigating the impact of parental involvement on child-related outcome measures. So overall, you'll see I've put 13, then in brackets I've put 14 studies were included in the review. There were 14 studies that were included. However, upon close examination, it became apparent that one study was reporting follow-up measures from another study that was included in the review. Therefore, that study, we didn't include all of the child characteristics and parent characteristics and all of the other data we were extracting from that study, but we did include the follow-up measures, outcome measures at the end. So these were all of the 14 studies that were included, and you'll see here I've just highlighted to you the study. This was the study that reported the follow-up essentially and sustained outcome measures for this study just below it here. So we did include the results from that, but we didn't include all of the child-parent characteristics. As you'll see, it's the same sample that was utilised. So in terms of the results, as mentioned, methodological characteristics was one of the research questions, and a question that we were hoping to understand further through this review. Overwhelmingly, quantitative methods were utilised, with 4 of those being randomised control trials, and standardised outcome measures were used across most of the studies, but there was a wide variety of standardised measures used across the studies. And by that, I mean not just in terms of the range, but how many studies had used. There were some studies that used up to 14 and some studies that used just 1. And control groups were only utilised in the RCTs. No other studies included a control element. The majority of the studies found were conducted in Western countries, with the most being conducted within the United States. And mothers tended to be the main caregivers participating in the intervention. There was only 1 study that required both primary caregivers, so both the mother and the father, to participate. But however, there was inconsistent reporting of demographic information across the studies, especially when it came to parents' backgrounds, with some reporting summaries of demographics or making statements rather than reporting data. And given that demographic information such as socioeconomic background has been found to be a variable to consider that impact educational outcomes, it would have been really valuable to have this data and to be able to explore this relationship further. 2 studies that did obtain some demographic information, they highlighted that parents in their sample were well educated. Another identified that due to their recruitment process, hard to reach parents were excluded, and another excluded parents that did not speak English. And it's important to note that these methodological characteristics could have impacted their results, as that's quite a large population that have been excluded within some of these studies. And you'll see in this table here, in terms of where the studies were based, that the settings varied in terms of, home, school, clinical, and by mixed, that includes a mixture of home, school, clinical, or university. So it's typically the same settings, but quite varied approaches. And there were 3 studies that took a multidisciplinary approach, and they involved parents, school, and healthcare professionals within the intervention. So the training was, and the parental involvement intervention was included for all, which can help to break down barriers for parents and create more communication and developed communication between the agencies involved. Now, training interventions were the primary type of intervention used. All of the training interventions involved sessions with the researchers and clinicians, and this includes psychoeducational sessions that were either group-based or individual. And the interventions included training teachers with classroom strategies, or training professionals working within the schools, and parents and the child simultaneously. Now, with these, it's quite, you'll see from here that the multidisciplinary kind of approach was only in a minority of studies, but parental, of course, was within all of them. And there was only 1 that included that included instructional intervention, where parents were provided with instructions over the phone and also sent a manual, but further support was not in place. Sorry, I've just realised I've made an error in that should read 2. There were 2 that were instructional interventions, and they just involved a phone call. 1 sent a manual, the other did not. And after the phone call, that was the extent of the support that was provided for those parents. And they were primarily led by the researchers or the clinicians. And there was quite a split between those that used group and those that used individual sessions. There were 6 interventions that were delivered to parents and groups, and 5 were delivered independently. But there were 3 that did actually include both an independent and group component. So There also appeared to be a limited number of interventions that focused on well-being. You'll see from this chart here that only 2 focused on well-being, and one was on anxiety management strategies and the other was on sleep management strategies, and they were both for children that have been identified as having autism. And this was quite interesting, as you know, especially within recent years, there's been quite a range of research that has indicated an element of concurrency between, you know, some mental health conditions and well-being factors with special educational needs. But predominantly the interventions were focused on young people with ADHD. And I wasn't surprised by this, as I'm sure many of you aren't, as there isn't, you know, quite a focus within research on ADHD and autism. But this again highlights the lack of interventions for parents of children with other needs. Now, we grouped the outcomes into 3 categories, as I mentioned at the start. So we had education, behaviour and well-being. And again, as you can see, most of the interventions focused on behavioural and educational outcomes. Now, across all of the studies, there were 830 children that were included. And the needs across the studies, you know, there were 44 young people included for that had autism, 697 that had ADHD, 10 with intellectual disabilities, 13 that they had an unspecified educational need, but they were on the school's SEN register, but they were identified as having literacy difficulties. And 47 for social, emotional, behavioural needs, and then 19 for intellectual disabilities and autism. But from those figures that I've just expressed, 697 were ADHD. So there was quite a vast majority of the studies, and the number of children that participated were individuals, young people identified as having attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. So this was really interesting because in terms of the impact that the interventions had on outcomes, positive results were recorded across the studies, which again, I mentioned publication bias at the start. You know, we tried to mitigate that by ensuring that grey literature was included within this review. But based on, you know, these findings and all of the positive results that were recorded, only 5 studies included follow-up measures. And, you know, there weren't evaluations of lasting effects that were measured across the studies, which I think would have been incredibly beneficial. 5 studies included parent-related outcome measures, and all 5 found that parental involvement interventions increased parental efficacy and that they increased knowledge. 2 found that they increased parental engagement at home. However, parental related measures were not evaluated across all studies, and this measure alongside the child-related outcomes measure would have been really valuable in directing future parental involvement interventions. And again, some of the studies were far more robust with their outcome measures. I mentioned at the start that there were some that had used standardized measures, most of them, 12 of them, had used standardized measures, but there were some that had 14 different outcome measures and standardized measures, and some that just had 1. So it's a very varied approach to the outcome measures and measuring the impact of the interventions. And in terms of gaps within the research literature, I think, you know, one thing that stood out was sample sizes. You know, sample sizes ranged from 2 participants to 204, with 5 studies having sample sizes below 15 participants. And power was not calculated across all studies, which really impacts, you know, the statistical significance. So this is something that I think future research really needs to take into consideration. 3 of the studies, and one of them being the one that I'd highlighted in red, this was the Pfeiffer et al. 2018, they all evaluated the same intervention. Now, although results indicated positive outcomes, this again further highlights that there is a lack of parental involvement interventions. If we're thinking, you know, if I'm talking about the 14 rather than the 13 studies, if out of those 14, 3 of them are looking at the same parental involvement intervention, and 2 of those 3 are looking at the same sample, it really does continue to highlight the lack of studies within this area. And studies that did report follow-up results indicated that there were some lasting impacts. However, again, more research needs to be conducted in understanding the long-term benefits of these interventions. And, you know, in terms of robust research designs, having comparison groups in place in order to better ascertain the impact of the interventions would have been incredibly valuable. And finally, the parent demographics. I was actually quite surprised at the lack of reporting, considering that it was a parental involvement intervention. Including demographic information on the family provides really rich, valuable contextual information that could provide further knowledge on how to develop interventions that support all families. So I think that is something, again, that future research needs to consider. And in terms of, just to summarize this paper and the research that we conducted, interventions appear to have a positive impact, but again, I think we need to be mindful of publication bias here, and you know, follow-up assessments as well need to be conducted to determine the long-term impact, as well as taking into consideration the sample sizes within the research. There is limited research on parental involvement interventions. Training interventions were the most common type, and I think looking at multimodal and more varied approaches to parental involvement interventions is something that could be considered in terms of making interventions more accessible as well for a range of parents, and ensuring that interventions are including a sample that is representative of the population. As I mentioned earlier, there were 3 studies that had excluded parents based on lack of English, or you know, that had included just a sample of parents that were all well educated or educated to college level and above. And there is limited research on parental involvement interventions for a range of special educational needs, and as well as their outcomes. Again, well-being measures were, and research focusing on well-being was within the minority, and ADHD was within the majority within this research. So future research does need to take that into consideration. I hope I haven't spoken too fast or been too confusing, but thank you for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
That was great, Anna. Thank you very much. Very clear. I think the speed was okay, but this is my personal feedback. I can see a lot of clapping hands coming on. I don't know if you can see them. There's, is it Heba? Do you want to put your mic on? Yeah?
Yes. I didn't have any questions. I just wanted to say thank you. That was super interesting and really informative, because my research is with parents from ethnic minority groups. So yeah, 100% agreeing with Hannah that having some contextual information about the parents would be really, really useful. So thank you so much, Hannah. That was very informative. Thank you.
Thank you for coming, Heba.
Thanks.
I will leave some time for people. If you want to ask any question, you can put them on the chat. So Hannah, Laura, she's picking up on this point as well about the lack of demographics on parents. I am going to ask a question, but if anyone else has any question, Nadina, do you please jump in at any point?
I have a question, but I think it's more a concern of our field of research. In that sense, you mentioned that the sample size of the experiments, it's quite limited in most of the cases. And this is something that I think happens quite frequently in studies that involve population with special educational needs. So I would like to hear or raise this discussion on what do you think we as researchers could do to avoid this happen or reach bigger sample sizes. that could be my question or discussion. Or
I think you've raised a very important point, Nadina, because I think one barrier that needs to be, and you know, this is more from experience, having worked with parents of individuals of special educational needs, it's ensuring that there aren't barriers in terms of the accessibility of research. I think one thing that can appear, especially when it comes to research, and whether it's in consent forms or explaining the research, is it can be very jargon heavy. It can use language that is not always accessible to all parents in terms of understanding what the research involves or understanding the research within itself. And what, you know, we need to break down that barrier and making sure that, you know, the way that we articulate and share the research and the research that's going to be conducted is accessible for all parents. You know, that the research that excluded all English, those that did not speak English, there are ways around that. There are ways around ensuring that actually it's representative of the population that that we work within, but also in ensuring that it is accessible, whether it's a language barrier or a variety of barriers. But that's something that I've come across from reading consent forms myself and thinking, actually, the parent, many parents may find this quite, and I know I'm generalizing here, you know, some parents may not find it difficult, but we should always ensure that actually we are articulating it in a way that all parents will find accessible. So that's one thing that I think research needs to take into consideration, actually how accessible. Have we considered the barriers to parents being involved within research, whether it's childcare, you know, whether it's, you know, the venue, whether, you know, the virtual. I think one thing that came with COVID that really, you know, changed my world is that actually so much can be done virtually, and how can we utilize and maximize the impact of this new virtual, well, the virtual world's always been there, but, you know, this new virtual space to ensure that we are accessible to all. So I hope that's kind of answered your question.
Sure, totally agree. Thank you very much.
And linking to Nadina's question that was talking about also about the sample sizes, considering that you're running a systematic review and you are trying to put things together and kind of, it was really interesting that you mentioned the gaps in the literature, but I was thinking about what did you learn, what are the take-home messages from what you've read and all the papers that you analyzed. And I was thinking, when you, because you are considering so many outcomes, so many different methodological designs, and also you're comparing results from studies that have hundreds of participants, and some, you mentioned a couple, 2 participants. How did you manage to consider all of this when you are summarizing the results, and how was the process, and how did you make sense of all the findings, considering that they were so different, all these studies?
I'm glad you asked that, Erica. Before this session started, I was having a conversation with Erica and expressed to her that I'd finally submitted the write-up for this, and it's taken me from September to get that done. And part of that has been because it's, even in terms of data extraction, there are a number of, you know, factors and variables that I was extracting, you know, data on a number of things to ensure that actually a fair representation of the literature was being discussed within this research paper. So it took a lot of time, and it was quite difficult trying to ensure that actually all of the information was being captured and all of the data was being captured. And in terms of how the synthesis of this, the data was constructed, there were so many different ways to analyze this because of the number of different factors that we were examining. And we tried to focus it on looking at those 3 outcomes in terms of the behavioural, the educational, the well-being, and really unpicking and understanding that, as well as the pupil, the child and parent characteristics and secondary outcome measures. And I think in terms of the second part, well, second part of your question, the take homes from this, for me, it really emphasized and highlighted the need for further research within this area, but also the need for robust and rigorous experimental designs within this research, and whether it's sample size, whether it's control groups, just to really understand and get a more in-depth understanding of what is happening. And that's not to say that the studies that were included are not, because actually there's so much that those studies have contributed and so much that they have enabled us to understand from what was, from the research that they've conducted. But also another element for me has been the, co-production and ensuring that, and this kind of touches onto what Nadina mentioned earlier in terms of sample size. And I think co-producing with parents and children and teachers is another important factor to consider when it's interventions that are for them. And what do these parents need? And through having those discussions and focus groups or interviews, or just ensuring that there's a forum that is available to have that conversation and open up that dialogue in terms of what do they need, and what would be supportive, is really important.
And how many of these interventions were co-produced?
None.
So that's very interesting findings.
Yeah, very. Yeah, and it is, for me, that I discussed the rationale of why this study was conducted, but we're considering a parental involvement intervention and creating one. So this was really informative in terms of understanding the landscape and understanding actually where are the gaps here and what else needs to be done to further support parents within this area.
I will keep asking questions, and I stop me, and if anyone else wants to chip in, please. I see thumbs up. A lot of people are agreeing with you in the chat and with their camera off, Anna. So we will keep going. I have a question that is related to, you mentioned mixed methods and qualitative methods. Can you give an example of this? Because qualitative methods, did you mean the way the outcomes were measured?
Yeah, sorry, I should have clarified that in terms of how the outcomes were measured. So in terms of the design, some utilised outcome measures that gave them quantitative results, but also incorporated focus groups or interviews into that as well in order to further ascertain and support their research findings.
Yeah, okay, makes sense. And so I think that my next question would be, what is going to be next? So you mentioned there is going to be an intervention maybe. Is this, and what did you learn? And did you have an idea of the intervention you wanted to run before you concluded and you did this synthesis of the literature? And did you change your plan? How did you change them? How this systematic review help you with the next step of your studies?
In terms of what's next, the next step we're currently working on, the current project is a questionnaire followed by a focus group that looks at parent expectations and teacher expectations of parental involvement. As I've seen a range of literature that focuses on their views, but not so much their expectations. So ascertaining what each group expects in terms of parental involvement would be really interesting to uncover and further examine. So that, again, with the systematic review, will continue to inform and shape, hopefully, a parental involvement intervention, which would be the end goal and the final project. But that is, both of these projects will hopefully then inform the parental involvement intervention. And in terms of the parental involvement intervention, I can't tell you right now what it looks like, because I guess, I don't know, many of you probably feel the same way. The more you read, the more you don't know. And you fall down a rabbit hole of ideas and you're like, well, it could be this, it could be this, it could be this. So currently there are some ideas, but we're still trying to navigate that area in terms of actually how do we maximize the impact of this intervention and what would be the most effective.
And you mentioned a few different types. So the instructional type of intervention was really interesting for me. I always, every time I think about an intervention, I think about the training. But this other way, that was interesting. But also because it is about parental involvement, I was thinking about the duration and the time and the effort that is asked to families. We're talking about a particular population where families are involved in many aspects of their child's life. And I was thinking, was there a different effort or involvement of the parents depending on the different intervention? Was it based on the age of the child, the type of intervention? Can you tell us something about that?
Well, attrition was really low across all of the studies. All of the studies all reported really low levels of attrition where parents were continuing with the interventions, and the intervention, you know, dosage really varied from 14 days being the shortest intervention, and that was one of the instructional interventions, to 20 weeks, and these were the 20 weeks where had weekly sessions in place. So it really did vary in terms of dosage, but what was surprising was that, you know, attrition levels were very low across all of the studies, which is really promising, and I think indicates to some degree that parents want to be involved in these studies. Otherwise, you may expect, you know, with a 3-month intervention weekly, you know, 1 hour weekly intervention study, that you may have higher levels of attrition, but that wasn't the case.